Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is the Z-SEY Tuoyuan Katana. And a couple of quick notes before I get into the meat of the review. This is a review sample. It was sent to me for free. If you think that makes me biased, then you know at the start. Also, I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship. I'm trying to get better at it, but I'm not an authority figure in the subject, so keep that context in mind as you hear me babble on throughout the course of this video. Some other bits to note right at the front. This is around about $1,000 retail. Right now it's on sale for $900. It's been on sale for about that price for a while now, but how long that sale will go, I don't know. It's also among the lesser options from Z-SEY. That doesn't make it a bad sword necessarily, but it is among the least expensive options Z-SEY has. So there are things that go up from here. It doesn't seem like there's too many that go down from here, but it should give you some idea of the value or what unique features Z-SEY as a company can offer. They're not necessarily new to making swords, incidentally, but they're not one that I had heard of prior to kind of reaching out and telling me about their products and anyway, they're a newer brand in my mind, but I don't necessarily think they're new to making swords. Also, my typical shtick in making these videos is to push them and break them, and that's not going to happen in this. I will push it, I will diminish the sword, but I don't think anyone is going to argue that I pushed the sword particularly far in this video, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is my personal health. I've got a wicked case of tennis elbow. That's one reason that this sword kind of moved up in the ranking for review. It's light and easy to move around and has been very fun to train with, despite my diminished condition, but it hurts to whack swords into things at the moment, and so that's one thing kind of standing in the way is if I push it into things, it kind of hurts me to do it. The other is I don't think somebody that is buying a Z-SEY sword is really going to buy it because it's a super sword or really durable. Among the product offerings they have, that doesn't seem to be the target that they're going after. So if you're a person that wants a really, really durable sword, something that's going to handle well in the zombie apocalypse or the end of days, or something that's going to be really, really forgiving as a training tool, I don't think this is the right product for you. And it doesn't look like Z-SEY offers many products that would be along that line. The value that they offer is different. I do think they have a compelling, nice value proposition for customers. I'll explain what that is in the video, but you're not going to see me do my typical thing, which is beat the snot out of the sword. So anyway, with that in mind, hopefully it's still interesting. I will go over bits, bobs, fit features, all that kind of stuff. And I do think there's a lot of cool stuff here. Hopefully you find the video interesting. In a future date, depending on what the comments down below say, if you want to see it pushed further, then let me know, and I may make a follow-up video where I do that when I'm in a better position to do so. Anyway, on with the show. So I typically start with the Kashira, the pommel, the end bit here, and that's what I'm going to do here. Now, the first thing I'll note about the fitting set is that they're not particularly unique to me. I've seen this fitting on a $200 Hanban forged katana. I've seen this fitting on or one like it from Yamato Bidogu. I don't know if this is like a recast of a Japanese Iaito fitting, or if it is like a fitting set that has, I don't know, is common or reproduced from like a piece, an antique piece or something. Nevertheless, the first place I saw it was like at a Yamato Bidogu or a Tazando kind of fitting set that it looks a little bit different, but this looks like a recast version. The Ishime kind of finished, the stone part looks a little bit more open, a little bit more porous than on some of the other versions that I've seen, and it is also well cast. The lines are crisp and sharp. It's just that I've seen it before, and one potential option for Z-SEY, I don't know if all their fittings are like this, but when you get into the higher echelon of swords, I really like to see things that are unique and that I don't see on Iaito from Japan, or that are recast fittings from some other company. I like to see things that are unique to the brand itself. Hanwei does this, Skyjiro does this, other brands do this in this price point. Obviously, I'm sure it adds to the cost. These are not bad fittings, incidentally. They suit the theme, I think, well, and they're well executed, but I would like to see something unique. For what these fittings are, though, they are porous. They have like a tactile feeling to them at the same time. They're not sharp. I don't feel them biting into my hand or anything when I was practicing. They didn't do anything bad. Incidentally, they did a lot of things good in that the Kashira stayed on. I did some bad cuts and things, and the Kashira didn't come loose. It remains tight. It's got a separate little shiridome in here that looks different. A lot of times these have like a little washer, toothy section on them that many swords use the same, shiridome pattern. This appears a little bit different, and I like to see that it looks a little nicer. The knots are tight. The transitions are good around the Kashira area. There's one little ledge, a very small one, but I would say given that this is around about $1,000 sword, that's what I'm thinking about it as. This meets expectations. There's opportunity for improvement here. Again, there's subjective feedback on the style of fittings being, more unique, but just in the fit set, there's small ledges, small areas where it doesn't fit perfectly. So it could be just a little bit better, but that's not a lot of bad feedback. And you're going to notice that throughout the review. There's not really a lot of bad here. There's opportunity for improvement, certainly, but I would say, generally speaking, the fittings, the fitment, the fit finish level is to be expected in $1,000 price point and above a lot of the potential competitors out there. There's a lot of sword companies that will charge you $1,000 that do not feel as good as this sword or address as many small little nuances. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but they do generally some pretty good stuff. Anyway, moving on. The knots are tight, and the Ito, if I just kind of move up to the handle, is overall tight. There are some spots over the Menuki where things move around a little bit, but really I can press very hard here, and I don't feel much more than like maybe a millimeter, half a millimeter in some spots of displacement of the Menuki, or not the Menuki, the Ito, the knots, the folds here. That's overall pretty good, pretty tight. I haven't felt it loosen or worsen in any way over the course of time that I've been practicing with it. It's worth noting that I've had it over a change of seasons, and so a lot of times things will loosen up when it dries out. When it's humid and stuff out, things tend to be a little bit tighter. When it cools down, I start to see some shrinkage, and that's when things loosen up, and I haven't seen that here, which is, again, a good sign. Shape of the handle as well, I really like. I think it is a handsome feeling shape. There's a subtle kind of wasted shape to it, and then it's just not too big. And I really happen to like that. I have kind of meaty sausage hands, which people tell me I mention too often in reviews, but I think it's important to note that I have a larger mitt, and I still prefer smaller handles. This feels good to me. If you have smaller hands, medium hands, I imagine it's going to feel good to you. It doesn't have like the axe handle feel. It's not too bulbous. My comfort level is generally on the smaller side. This is kind of on the medium small, if you will. There are some larger nodules in the Samegawa as well, so I can make out some larger nodules. There's the Emperor node on one side. It's on the right side as well, so as this rests in your obi, the Emperor node is facing outward, and you can show your bling to everyone. The Ito did have some mild fraying and some staining as well, so not super bad, nothing that's terrible, but there were some minor imperfections, I would say, in the surface of the Ito when I got it. Perhaps that's because the sword was handled. It's a review sample, after all, or it could be the way it came out of the box. I'm not entirely sure, but it is worth noting that the way I got it had some minor signs of handling, or not necessarily wear, but minor fraying, minor little imperfections in the Ito. Nothing bad, but if I'm being really nitpicky, which I think is fair in the $1,000 price category, it's worth noting that I saw some of that. The silk feels of a very good quality, though, as well. So sometimes I run my hand across it. You might be able to hear it in the microphone here, but this doesn't feel synthetic-y or cheapy. It feels like real silk. It feels good on the hand. The Menuki that rest in here are also in a floral theme, also have really good casting quality. So I appreciate that. Again, something that I've seen before, but thematically go well with the little sakura blossoms or the cherry blossoms that are on the fittings here. The diamonds are reasonably even, reasonably well shaped. They don't move around too much. They don't vary in size too much. I think there's opportunity to be a little bit better, but at the same time, for $1,000, again, Ito is one of the things that almost universally swords in this price point miss holistically. It's not uncommon to find $1,000 swords, $2,000 swords with Ito that is loose, that will be risky of loosening to a greater degree or coming unraveled. This isn't the case. The diamonds vary a little bit. Overall, this is really good work, and I think it's perfectly acceptable for a sword in this price point. I would argue that it's even good for a sword in this price point. There's a single Mikugi as well that goes through here that is, I suppose, more traditional. Oftentimes you see two. One makes it a little easier to tighten on the sword. At least that's what I've heard. I found this to disassemble. It required a little percussive persuasion to get the handle off, but once it slid off, it slid back on pretty easily. It could be just because of the weather change, but single Mikugi as well. And the Mikugi is actually well shaped. I mean, it's a small little nuance, but the edges are rounded, and it's a better shaped Mikugi. This little bamboo peg is something that not a lot of places give any attention to, and it's those little things. The little attention to detail tells me that if they rounded the little edges on the bamboo peg, And the bamboo peg, which you did have to hammer out, didn't like dent. It's not made of a chopstick. It appears to be maybe a fire hardened bamboo or something a little harder. But that little detail, that little attention to the peg that goes into it, tells me that they're paying attention to a lot of the little details here, and it's just something that I like to see. Anyway, nicely formed peg. Again, it did require a little bit of persuasion to get the handle off. Once it went off, it went back on pretty easily. I didn't find that there were any cracks in the tsuka core after usage. I wasn't particularly abusive with it, worth noting, but the footage that I have for you of the core was after I used it. There were no cracks, and there's little shims and stuff like that that show that it's fit right. Now, this is worth noting that it'd be preferred if it was just carved perfectly and didn't have those shims on it. But again, the shims are for a $1,000 sword, totally acceptable. That means somebody went over, thought about fitting it, thought about how it should fit right, and took the time to make the adjustments and didn't, just say the customer won't notice. So again, those little details are appreciated and good. Moving up to the fuchi up here, the transition is actually excellent. I really like how the ito butts up to the bottom rim, and then there's this little dip in the fuchi. Aesthetically, I think it matches really well, and it transitions well on every side. There's not a ledge or anything like that. I think they did a really good job. And the fuchi, of course, matches the Kashira thematically. It looks overall pretty good. There are copper seppa and brass fittings, and then a copper habaki. I think the metal work here is okay. There's also copper or brass shiridome on the saya. Generally speaking, I like to stick to fittings that have one consistent type of metal used. Here, I don't necessarily mind it aesthetically. I think it actually works reasonably well. The manuki as well are like a silver colored or a steel colored underneath. So there's a few different types of metal used, but nothing pulls my eye inherently to it. Aesthetically, I think it blends well, and I don't mind the different use of metals, but typically that's something that tends to rub me the wrong way. In this case, for whatever reason, it does not. Moving up to the Tsuba, I first want to call out actually the seppa around the Tsuba, that they don't overlap. So there's this little ring, the Nakago Ana, where the blade goes through the guard area here. And very often the seppa overlap this little ring around here. It's not uncommon here. They butt up flush, and one seppa is larger than the other. There's a top and bottom version. Again, a little subtle nuance to detail that I appreciate when they overlap. It's not bad. I've had very high-end custom swords that do that, but I prefer when they kind of sandwich together in a pretty way, and that's what I see here. So good execution there. The Tsuba as well is, I can't remember the shape. It's a pretty common shape. There's a name for this particular style. I certainly don't mind it. I think it works well. I have heard some other reviewers comment that the color, the paint doesn't look good. I can see like a seam in here, what appears to be a cast line. I don't necessarily mind the paint color, though I would, of course, prefer if this were a patinated piece of iron. That would be my preference aesthetically, and I think that would look better, but I don't mind the color. What I do like about the Tsuba is that it has dimension this way. Very often, the things are just water jet cut out or they're cast flat. This has kind of a third dimension here, and you can see that it's got a little, nubbins that are wider and narrower, and it looks like a better casting of an antique fitting. It's not sharp as well. I can run my hand up here and nothing bites into my hand, so it doesn't bite me. I do feel those little nubbins rub across my skin, of course, but at the same time, nothing sharp, nothing bites into me. And aesthetically, I would rather have something three-dimensionally shaped in a kind of a powder-coated patina, if you will, or a painted patina, which hasn't chipped off or anything like that. I haven't been too aggressive with the sword, but nothing's come off, and I did bump it with a hammer a few times to get it off, and it stayed straight and good. So while it looks a little dainty, it held up to some hammer blows to get the handle off. I would rather have it three-dimensional and this way than patinated. If that's a choice that the supplier had to make to keep costs down, then I think they made the right one. Opportunity for improvement, though, is to not paint it and to have it patinated naturally. I think that would add to the aesthetic of the sword. The Tsuba, though, is good. It's on there. It came off reasonably well. It appears to be fit on well, so there appear to be little hammer marks and stuff like that on the Tsuba that indicate that somebody took time to fit it properly. Again, little nuanced details that show me somebody held this sword and thought about how it should feel and put some time into making it fit right and come apart. Again, I did have to use a hammer to get it apart. That's not terribly uncommon, but it went back together without too much struggle. I didn't have to use the same level of percussive force to get it back together. All right, I'm going to move on to the Habaki. This is a copper Habaki. There's not a whole lot to talk about here. There's not any patterning or anything like that on it, but I like that it's made of copper. I often see them made of brass. That's just something I get used to seeing, so made out of a different material is my preference. It does appear that the Munmachi area, though, has some little area where there appear to be kind of little feet almost that cover up the back. They're subtle and small, but there's almost like a little bit of curve, a little thing there, which is a small detail, again, that it's the way it's supposed to be. The feet could be a little bit bigger. The Habaki could be a little better fit, but not really too much. Honestly, for a simple Habaki, this is really quite good. There's a little ledge in the back. It's supposed to be there. And there's a little space. It doesn't appear that the Habaki is scratching against the side of the blade. It appears to make contact in the front and the back, and that also appears good. It's not super tight on there, which is generally the right fitment. There's not supposed to be a lot of space there, but it's also not supposed to be scratching along the side of the blade and diminishing the polish. So I see some attempt to do that. Where I do take issue with the Habaki is how it fits in this scabbard. Now, Z-SEY offers a custom scabbard option. I don't know if that's what was sent to me. I don't know if this is the custom-made scabbard, which is an upcharge, or if this is the default scabbard. I suspect it's the default one. But when practicing, there's a little bit of space where the sword where it doesn't really glide in on rails, and sometimes the ledge of the Habaki whacks into the side of the sword. And if I kind of adjust it, it fits in well. But sometimes I would be sheathing, and the sidewall of the Habaki would bang into the koiguchi area of the sword. Now, if I filed it down a little bit, over time I'm sure it would wear and wouldn't be a problem for too long. But I did notice that. And it's more, I think, a fitment on the saya than on the Habaki here. Because overall, this looks like it has some nice shape. It also is a little bit of a pyramid shape. It's fatter on the bottom and kind of tapers up. Again, a good sign. A lot of times they are one solid shape column. They don't have any dimension. They don't kind of have a wider base to them. So I think the Habaki, even though it looks really simple, has some nuances that show me it's overall a good product. I'm going to move on to the saya. Now, good thing about the saya, it doesn't really rattle that much, and generally the sheathing was good. I talked a little bit about where I thought there was opportunity for improvement in that the Habaki did kind of whack a little bit on things, but overall it's pretty good. Now, again, the downside is I see this paint finish on lesser swords, right? So I think there's opportunity to do something a little zazzier. This is not a bad finish, though. It has a kind of a red ishime finish with a little black speckle on it. Doesn't show fingerprints really well. It's classy looking. I've seen it on $200 swords, so I'd like to see, if I'm doing a $1,000 sword, something a little bit more bespoke to the Z-SEY brand that stands out amongst other swords. That said, if you have to use common parts or paint, this is a good choice to do. It doesn't show fingers really well, fingerprints a lot. It's reasonably durable. It survived a move banging around with other swords and doesn't show too much wear. It's also worth noting that I see a very subtle slope towards the end. A lot of times the cheapest saya that I see are one solid tube all the way through. And here, just towards the top quarter, it starts to taper down ever so slightly. But it'd be nice if the taper was a little bit more gradual throughout the saya. It doesn't have to happen. Again, I've had very expensive custom swords that don't. And the thinner saya tend to degrade quicker. They can warp and stuff quicker, but it's nice when they have dimension to them. They don't have to, but it's a personal preference and an opportunity, I suppose. There's horn kojiri, the the kurigata, and the koiguchi's here. It's horn. There's a horn kurigata and a horn kojiri, the little end cap down at the bottom here. They fit on well. The transitions look pretty good. There's not a whole lot to say over here. It fit together pretty well. I would potentially like to see a little bit more dimension. It slides in pretty well. It's not super raspy. So as a training tool, like if you're putting the sword in and out and it goes, and it's loud and distracting, that wasn't the case here. The sageo that it came with also seemed to be of a reasonable quality. It wasn't the cheapest kind of shoestring stuff that was made, and it also doesn't seem to be the same as just more ito that was used here. So it's a little thicker, and it's a little bit on the longer side, which is nice. The seppa on the kurigata, though, were not glued in, and every time I get these, not the seppa, the shiridome, I keep using the wrong word here, these little washers that are put on the kurigata. When I untied the presentation knot, these little shiridome pieces came out, and what happens when they come out is they just kind of scratch on things. So I tend to remove them. If they're not glued in or secured in a way that's meaningful, then I just prefer that they're not in there at all. I understand why a vendor might leave them in there and not glue them in, because some people just hang the sword and it's a wall decoration and they look fine when they're in there, and gluing them in there, I suppose, makes it harder to get the sugeo in and out. But from a practical standpoint, when they just pop out, they scratch the sai, and I find it to be more of an irritation. So glue them in or remove them would be a recommendation from me. But from, again, a user perspective, this was quiet. Apart from banging on the sidewall, it was a very nice saya. The koiguchi area here, the mouth area, also doesn't have like resin and schmutz and gunk stuck in there. It doesn't appear that the habaki is hitting on the sidewalls either, which is a really good fitment. It appears that the tension is on the front and back of the habaki, which is kind of where it's supposed to be. It looks like it was just made and cut right as well. So it's funny that this looks like the same saya as many of the other $200 sword sayas that I've seen, but there's a little bit more refinement here. The fitment on the sword is much better. It doesn't have like glue and resin to make it fit. The tension is overall really good, and the horn pieces used blend in really well. It's a well-made saya. At the same time, I just feel like I've seen it before. But as a training tool, it looks nice. It functioned the way it was supposed to. For the $1,000 price point, again, all things considered, I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's not worth it. There's, I'm making a little nuanced complaints here, but I still think overall this is a pretty good saya and something that's fair to be expected in the price point of the sword. So speaking of the sword, let's move on to the blade, the pointy stabby part. The first part of the blade I'm going to talk about is the nakago, the bit under this handle here. So I disassembled the sword, I took it out, and I looked at the butt of the sword. Now, there's some attention to detail here, which I think is really nice. At the same time, I think there's an opportunity to see more detail here. So the nakago was well shaped. There's kind of file marks that are attempting to make the nakago more beautiful. And again, in the $1,000 sword price point, many manufacturers don't do anything to beautify the nakago because most people don't take the sword apart. And if you don't take the sword apart, you're spending a bunch of time and money, and therefore money, on something that your customer is never going to see. But the blades that this sword is trying to historically emulate usually have some usurime, some file marking, some sort of attention to the nakago here, and it's a sign that if you're putting attention into the nakago, a thing that a lot of people aren't going to see, that you put attention in other places that customers can't see, like the heat treatment and stuff like that. So I love to see that there's detail here. It'd be cool if there was a signature or something like that indicating whoever made the sword. I always appreciate a signature on the sword. It doesn't have to be there. The file markings as well, they're there, but they're not great, frankly. So they're there. At the same time, I think more effort could be put into making the lines a little cleaner. There's some rippling in the nakago. There's some spots where it looked like they were trying to do a different pattern and then just kind of stopped, maybe for lack of time or because it's not terribly important or it fit. Again, effort is put in here. It's among the prettier nakago. I think, again, you could put a little bit more time into it. And I say that because there are swords from Huawei, a competitor, obviously, that sell swords in a similar price point, and they have more refined nakago at a lesser price point. There are, again, also many competitors out there that charge $2,000 for a sword. I remember looking at the nakago of my higher-end Hanwei swords, and they were not as refined as this one is. There's been plenty of other swords, I guess I should say, over $1,000 that don't put as much effort in here. So it's overall good to see it. I'm just always asking for more. Otherwise, if I move on to the rest of the blade, there are other things that are really nice. If I talk about the shape of the blade, it's not an order of magnitude different in terms of shape than many other swords from Longquan, China. If I hold this up to a $200 sword, the general profile of the sword, at least in terms of shape and curvature, is not much different. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It allows you to use some similar saya and maybe some like parts or something like that. And it's not a bad shape. It's just one that I'm used to seeing, but there's a ton of refinement in the rest of the sword. That's kind of where the similarities end. The BoHi here is really well executed. It terminates beautifully at the Kisaki. It doesn't have a whole lot of ripples. The only surface ripples that I see in the sword are in the BoHi, which is common, and there's very few of them, which is a tough thing to do. The polish on the sword is beautiful, and I think the polish on the sword, if I could draw your attention to one item on the sword that makes Z-SEY different, it would be the polish. And this is not their most expensive polish. It's probably among their more basic polishes, but it's excellent. It's beautiful to see, and I don't know of another sword company for $1,000 that's making polishes like this. So if you're a person that wants something that isn't necessarily a Nihonto, isn't necessarily an authentic Japanese sword, either you don't have the money, but you want something aesthetically that looks really close to that style of polish, then this is about as close as you can get in my mind. There's some banding effects in the metal. I know this is supposed to be like a proprietary bloomery steel. I can't remember the steel. I don't know if it's folded. There's some spots in here that look like a mokume style kind of pattern, but realistically the hot is really tight. It could just be banding in the metal. I don't know for certain. What I can say is it is beautifully polished either way. It's similar, more so than other Chinese swords I've seen, to a Japanese style polish, and it's really something to look at. There's a lot to get lost in here, and it's a lot to be appreciated. And there are, I think, customers, there's some that want a really, really durable sword. If you're going to go out and use it, it gets scratched. I've used this sword and the polish is now diminished because I cut a few mats and bottles and such with it. So the polish will diminish, but at the same time, it's really something special to look at. If you take your collection out, admire it in the light, then there's a lot to appreciate here in the polish. The Kisaki as well is burnished, and it actually looks burnished. There's a very prominent yokote here, and I can make out, it doesn't just look like it's sanded the other direction or etched differently. It looks like somebody took a burnishing rod to it and spent time on it. And so that is what stands out in terms of the Z-SEY is the polish. And knowing that they can go even higher than this is really special. I haven't seen examples of their even higher end work, but there's really a lot to appreciate in this one. If this is their base level, I'd be interested in seeing what the next level up is, because this already is really something I think quite special. The other bit to note, apart from the, I've talked about the shape, I've talked about the polish, and that generally it's overall smooth and well done, and it's also, it just feels really good. Now, this doesn't have like a spear Kisaki on it. It doesn't swell at the tip. I'd like to see that. I generally tend to like that in swords, but it's still pretty loud. So if I swing this around, it's really easy to get the wind sound, the swishy sound as I move it around, which was helpful in training. I could hear it really well as I was using it. So if you're looking to train with a shenken or something as a live blade, it was comfortable to use, it's comfortable to hold, it's pretty light in the hand. I'll put measurements and all that kind of stuff in the description down below, incidentally. But it's easy to use in one hand with a sore elbow, and it's easy to hear the feedback if you're doing the technique right, which I really, really appreciate it. I'm usually with a live blade trying to go a little bit slower, and it's nice that this one is very, very audible for me to hear. Sometimes I get swords and they're quiet. Sometimes the other people training at a dojo can hear it and I can't. This one I could tell if I was swinging the sword correctly. So that is also an appreciative thing. When using it, if I just talk about using it, doing the Ido with it was really, really a joy. It's a very light sword, and so it doesn't have a lot of niku on it. It's definitely a smaller, more agile, nimble sword, and it's reminiscent of my Yaito, in fairness. So as I was training with it, it's just really nice. It was a really enjoyable thing. The only complaint I had was the Habaki knocking on the Koiguchi area of the saya. Once I got used to it, I didn't slam it in there so much. It didn't bother me so much, but that's really about it. Otherwise, it was easy to move around. It was easy to do one-handed or two-handed techniques. It was very audible as a training partner. I could hear when I was doing things right or wrong. It didn't bite my hands. The Ito feels tight, and I felt a strong connection to the sword in terms of like it wasn't going to wiggle around in my hand. It didn't turn around in my hand if I hold it and then try to twist it. It doesn't move at all. So I felt a really good kind of connection to the sword, not like emotionally. I mean that my hand felt secure. It didn't feel like it was going to twist around. I didn't feel like I was going to lose it. With my grip strength failing a little bit, that was important to me. So doing some of these one-handed techniques, I mitigated the pain that I was experiencing with my elbow, and you know, my ability to lose my grip here, and I still felt secure and connected to the blade. So that I really liked, and again, that was what bumped this sword up in the line of testing, I suppose I would say. There were other swords that were ahead of it that I was planning on reviewing first, but this one is the lightest among them and the easiest for me to train with, and therefore that's what I've started spending time with, because it's a more forgiving training partner, or a lighter training partner. So anyway, I really enjoyed it from a training aspect, and I think if you're used to using a lighter Yaito, this will be a sharp option for you to consider. Anyway, hopefully the notes on using it for Yaito in general practice have been helpful. Using it for cutting is not necessarily the sword's strong suit. Not that it can't. This is like a sword that you could get in, do some harassing cuts with, be agile with. It's certainly strong enough to be used as a sword, but at the same time, it's not terribly forgiving. It's very sharp, so when the initial cuts that I was doing, I was actually really impressed that it moved through used Japanese tatami mats. It's also worth calling out that I tested it specifically on used Japanese tatami mats. These are not forgiving, they're not light, they can be very hard to cut, and so I don't know that you would consider this abusive cutting at all. It's not as though I was cutting through boards and logs and 2x4s and metal and stuff like that. But used Japanese tatami can bend swords. It can be a tougher target to cut through. And this sword really sailed right through them. Now, I'm a big guy, so getting momentum with the sword isn't hard for me, even with an injury. But the sword had the edge to really sail right through. It was excellent for that, and it held the edge. I've only cut a few mats and bottles and stuff with it, but the edge didn't diminish. It's still razor sharp. I can still shave with it. Anyway, so the general cutting, it did okay, but the part to really call out here is the lightness really lets you focus on technique. The sword isn't going to do a lot of work for you. You have to throw it out there with momentum. You have to use your technique correctly if you're a smaller person and don't just have mass in your arms to move through a target. It's not going to do the work for you. You gotta have the right technique with a lighter sword, but it has the edge to move through the targets. It's also really fun. So there were some other folks that were cutting with me on the day. A young guy came over, his dad, with some supervision and some training. we had him do some cutting, and this is the one that he was the most successful at cutting with because it was lighter and he could control it. It was just an observation that somebody that doesn't have, isn't used to moving big old blades around is gonna, maybe find some success in using this lighter sword. It came with an edge sufficient to do tatami cutting. What it also did, though, is on a bad cut. So I was practicing some draw cutting. So I was moving it from the sheath to the target, not just lining myself up. And in doing that, I'm not used to doing it. I'm a novice at it. You can see that, but I threw some bad cuts at it, and the sword bent. It didn't take a huge bend, and I could lay it on my leg and kind of straighten it out. It still has like a slight kind of bend to it, but overall it's straighter now. But I bent the sword doing a bad cut, and so that's why, again, I don't feel so bad about not pushing this sword further. It bent on tatami, not so much that I couldn't straighten it. I'm not particularly good at straightening it either, but it was able to be straightened out, and but it bent, and that means that if I take this on sticks and do a bad cut, it's gonna cant over and take a set pretty easily. I could also straighten it on my knee with some mild force, so it's soft. It's gonna bend if you're doing aggressive things with it. If it bent on tatami, then it's gonna bend if I proceed with my typical line of testing. It's not a super durable sword. It requires that you're doing technique correctly. If you're doing it, it's a fine cutting companion. If you're doing it incorrectly, it's not going to be forgiving, but it can be straightened out to a certain degree. If I'm doing double, triple mats, if I'm cutting wood cores, if I'm doing anything like that, it wouldn't surprise me if it took a lot steeper twists or bends or things like that. Now, is the edge going to hold up to like cutting metal and stuff? I would suspect not. I don't think it's going to do that. So again, durability, I think seeing bending in cutting tatami indicates to me that durability is not the sword's focus. So that's where I started to see some damage again. I could straighten it out. It did that just fine, and now it's reasonably back to straight enough where I don't necessarily notice it, and everything seems in line. If I do a few further cutting, I do see some scratches and stuff like that on the surface of the blade as well, and so the polish is diminished. Not in a terrible way, but definitely I would be irritated if I paid $1,000 for a sword that really focused on polish, and then I cut with it and saw a bunch of cutting scratches. So Anyway, that was the experience cutting. It did the job actually surprisingly well, but it's not a forgiving sword. So that is really all the stuff that I can share with you about the sword. Hopefully it's been enough to help you make a decision on if it's worth it for you. I suppose now I answer the question though myself, do I personally think it's worth the $1,000 or $900 if you're able to get it on sale? And for me, yes, there's a lot to like here. Now, it's not durable, right? That's kind of the elephant in the room. It's not a super strong sword. It's not going to be terribly forgiving. It's not your companion for the zombie apocalypse, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to offer. The fit and finish on here is really quite good. So if you're looking for something that is just done well and on a budget, not that $1,000 is cheap, but it's really quite good. The fit and finish, there's nothing here that I can really say immediately is not worth the money or beneath the overall price point. Overall, they've done a good job there, which is tough because that's usually the failing of a lot of swords. There are other companies like Huawei that give you similar, maybe not the same level of materials, maybe not the same level of polish, but similar fit and finish for a little bit less. So it's not to say it can't be done, but it's nice to see that there's another person out there doing most of the stuff out there well. And so I like the fit. The polish is also at another level. The polish is beyond the rest of the sword, frankly. And so if you're looking for something that is reminiscent or closer to Japanese style sword polishes, this is an option for you. Also, if you're a training person and you want something that isn't a super sword to train with and something that may be closer to what historical Japanese swords were actually like, I'd venture to guess that this is probably a lot closer to the durability level of most Nihonto or most antiques that you might cut with than a lot of the modern homogeneous steels and other swords or wider swords or thicker swords or competition cutting swords out there. So if you're looking for a more authentic experience in that regard, then this may also be a little bit closer to that. But I think the polish as well, it's just beautiful to look at and something really, really special if you're a collector, somebody that admires the artistry in polish and bringing out some characteristics in the steel. There's really not a lot that I could tell you is out there for $1,000 that does the same thing. And the general build quality seems really good on the blade. Transitions of the BoHi are excellent, both near the Habaki and near the Kisaki. It's really quite spectacular if you look at the sword and just enjoy the characteristics of the steel. And I know a lot of you focus on performance. Performance-wise, it cut reasonably well, just not forgiving. Training-wise, excellent to move around. I could see using this if just competition cutting isn't your main thing. It's excellent as a training companion. It's beautiful to look at. It's just not a forgiving sword. So if you're a person that doesn't mind that, if you're confident in your technique, if you want something that to cut with that's closer to the authentic experience, or if you're not interested in cutting and just want a beautiful sword, I think this is worthy of consideration, and a lot is packed into the $1,000. There's certainly opportunity for improvement, but I don't see it as a ripoff. I see this as a really compelling offering for a certain type of collector or sword buyer out there. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully it's been helpful. Thank you again to Z-SEY for sending me this review sample. If you guys have questions, again, I know I didn't push this particularly far. If you disagree with my assessment that pushing it further is just going to showcase that it is a softer sword and you want to see it anyway, let me know. And when I'm in a position to do that, I may make a follow-up video. But anyway, throw those commentary down below. That's all I've got for you. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.